A black couple, elegantly dressed and exuding quiet confidence, boards a first-class cabin, ready for what should be an uneventful flight. But within moments, the atmosphere shifts. A flight attendant, unable to mask her thinly veiled prejudice, questions their boarding passes, dismisses their requests with condescension, and targets them with unnecessary. The murmurs of other passengers grow as the couple remains composed, enduring the microaggressions with grace. Then, just 3 minutes later, the truth comes out. The couple calmly reveals their true identities as the CEO and CFO of the very airline they're flying on. The entire cabin falls silent. What happens next is a moment of reckoning that challenges biases, restores dignity, and leaves every passenger stunned. Stay tuned, this story is about to take off. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you find this story as powerful as we do, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling narratives like this. The terminal at Chicago O'Hare was alive with the hum of modern America, a restless, mechanical symphony of hurried footsteps, barking announcements, and the hollow clatter of rolling luggage. It was an unrelenting reminder of how, even as the world moved forward, the scars of the past lingered just beneath the surface. In the sanctuary of the first-class lounge, however, the noise fell away. Here, the floors gleamed like polished ice. The air was perfumed with freshly brewed coffee, and the voices were hushed, carrying the effortless confidence of those accustomed to privilege. Alexander Hayes adjusted the cuff of his tailored blazer as he held the door open for his wife, Camille. She stepped through with the grace of someone used to commanding attention without demanding it. Her simple silk blouse and understated jewelry spoke volumes. Quiet elegance earned respect. And yet, as they crossed into the lounge, an invisible shift rippled through the room, subtle but unmistakable. A few heads turned. A woman in the corner lowered her magazine, her gaze lingering just a second too long. Camille caught Alexander's eye, her expression serene but knowing. "Ready?" she murmured. "Always," Alexander replied, his voice low and steady. They approached the concierge desk where a young woman greeted them with a smile that faltered, just briefly, before settling into something overly bright. "Good morning," she said. Her voice carried a careful, polite tone that betrayed the undercurrent of hesitation. "May I see your boarding passes?" Alexander handed over the tickets without a word, his movements deliberate. The concierge's eyes flicked to the first-class designation and, for a fraction of a second, her carefully composed mask slipped. It was so fleeting that most wouldn't have noticed. But Camille did. It was there in the tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," the woman said after a beat too long. She handed back the tickets with a smile so tight it looked painful. "Enjoy your stay in the lounge." Camille waited until they had settled into a quiet corner, her back to the room but her eyes sharp as ever. "You saw that, didn't you?" she asked. Alexander leaned back in his chair, crossing one ankle over his knee. "Of course I did." "And?" Camille pressed. "And it's not the first time. And it won't be the last." His voice carried a weary resignation, but the glint in his eyes betrayed something sharper. Determination. For most, this trip might have been a simple luxury, a brief respite from the grind of daily life. But for the Hayes, this was a mission. As the CEO and CFO of Horizon Airlines, they had chosen to travel undercover, posing as ordinary passengers to investigate the whispers of bias and discrimination within their own company. Camille pulled out her tablet, scrolling through customer service reports. "The data doesn't lie," she said quietly. "Minority passengers report lower satisfaction scores across the board. And first class? It's worse." Alexander's lips tightened into a thin line. "We'll see for ourselves," he said firmly. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharply dressed lounge attendant, his demeanor warm and professional in contrast to the concierge. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, can I get you anything? Coffee? Tea?" "Coffee, thank you," Camille replied, her voice soft but commanding. As the attendant left, Camille's gaze swept the room. Most passengers were engrossed in their laptops or newspapers. But here and there, she caught a glance too long, too pointed. It wasn't hostility, it was curiosity. The kind that always carried an unspoken question. "Do you belong here?" "Let them wonder," Alexander said quietly, sensing her thoughts. By the time their flight was called, the tension in the air was palpable. Though no words had been exchanged, They stepped onto the plane and were greeted by a flight attendant named Victoria, whose polished smile barely concealed the flicker of surprise in her eyes when she saw them. She directed them to their seats 3A and 3B in first class with a tone that was more brusque than welcoming. As they settled in, Camille noticed the subtle shift in Victoria's demeanor. The way her eyes lingered on them a moment too long. The tightness of her movements. "Let the games begin," Camille murmured under her breath. Victoria's approach was slow and deliberate, her smile frozen in place as she leaned down to address them. "Good morning," she said, her voice syrupy and clipped all at once. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "We're fine, thank you," Camille replied evenly. Victoria lingered, her gaze flicking between them as if searching for a crack in their composure. When none came, she straightened and moved on. But not before Camille caught the faintest hint of a smirk. The first-class cabin hummed with the quiet luxury of soft jazz and whispered conversations. But beneath it all, an unspoken tension churned. Camille's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest, and Alexander's jaw clenched imperceptibly. They had prepared for this moment, but preparation did little to dull the sting of bias. As the plane ascended, Victoria hovered nearby, her gaze darting toward the haze with increasing frequency. Finally, she returned, this time with a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice louder than necessary. "There seems to be some confusion about your seating assignment." The cabin fell into a hushed silence, passengers glancing up from their magazines and tablets. "Our boarding passes say 3A and 3B, Alexander said, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I see that," Victoria replied, her tone growing sharper. "But our manifest doesn't show your names listed here. Are you sure you're in the right section?" Camille's gaze hardened, though her expression remained composed. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice like silk over steel. "I'm simply trying to ensure everything is in order," Victoria said, though the words rang hollow. The tension was no longer subtle. It was thick and suffocating, and every eye in the cabin seemed to be on them. Camille leaned back in her seat, her voice low enough that only Alexander could hear. "This is the moment," she said. "What we do next will define everything." Victoria Adams stood in the galley, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. The hum of the plane's engines seemed louder than usual, a low, insistent drumbeat that matched the quickening of her pulse. She wasn't sure why the couple in 3A and 3B unsettled her so much. But something about them felt off. They didn't fit the usual profile of her first-class passengers. No designer luggage, no loud conversations about vacation homes or private investments. Just calm, composed silence. It unnerved her. "Victoria?" Emily, a younger flight attendant, approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" Victoria forced a smile. "Fine," she said briskly. "Just double-checking the manifest." Emily hesitated, her brows knitting together. "Double-checking for what?" Victoria didn't answer. She flipped through the manifest again, even though she knew the names matched the tickets. Still, a nagging feeling clung to her, one she couldn't articulate, though deep down, she knew what it was. It wasn't about policies or protocols. It was about them. She returned to the cabin, clipboard in hand, her steps deliberate as she approached the couple. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, curiosity mingling with discomfort. In her mind, she was the gatekeeper of first-class standards, ensuring that everything and everyone was in its proper place. "Excuse me," Victoria said, stopping at their row. Her voice was clipped, professional, but loud enough to draw attention. "I just need to confirm something." Alexander looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. "What exactly do you need to confirm?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying a quiet authority. Victoria faltered for a fraction of a second but pressed on. "I need to see your boarding passes again. There seems to be a discrepancy with the seating chart." Camille handed over the tickets, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze never leaving Victoria's face. "Here you go," she said smoothly. "Take all the time you need." Victoria scrutinized the tickets as though she expected to find anything that would justify her unease. The names matched. The seat numbers matched. Everything was in order. And yet, she lingered, her lips pursed in frustration. "Is there a problem?" Camille asked, her voice steady but pointed. Victoria handed the tickets back with a tight smile. "Not at all. Just a routine check." Camille tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "A routine check? For whom?" Victoria's cheeks flushed. For all passengers, of course, she said, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. She stepped back, retreating to the galley, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her as she walked away. And for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept in. Back in their seats, Camille turned to Alexander, her voice low but firm. She's digging, looking for something that isn't there. I know, Alexander replied, his tone calm but tinged with an edge. Let her dig. The deeper she goes, the clearer it becomes. Camille's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. How far do you think she'll take this? Alexander leaned back, his eyes scanning the cabin. As far as we let her. The tension in the cabin was no longer subtle. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances at the couple in 3A and 3B. A middle-aged man across the aisle adjusted his tie nervously, pretending to read his newspaper but failing to mask his curiosity. An older woman 2 rows ahead whispered to her husband, her voice just loud enough to carry. I've never seen anything like this before, she murmured, her tone dripping with condescension. Camille heard it but said nothing. Instead, she turned her attention to the window, her reflection staring back at her. She had faced this kind of scrutiny her entire life, walking into boardrooms, entering restaurants, even simply existing in spaces where she wasn't expected. But here, at 30,000 feet, it felt sharper, more suffocating. Victoria returned, her movements sharper now, her smile more forced. She carried a tray of drinks, offering champagne to the other passengers with a warmth that felt performative. When she reached the haze, her demeanor shifted. Would you care for a drink? She asked, her tone overly polite, almost mocking. Just water, Camille replied, her voice steady. Victoria hesitated, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly before she nodded. Of course. As she turned to leave, her voice dropped to a murmur, just loud enough for the haze to hear. Some people just don't know their place. Camille's hand froze mid-reach. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Alexander, however, turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Victoria. Excuse me? He said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. Victoria froze, realizing she had been heard. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until a voice broke it. Is there an issue here? It was Emily, stepping into the tension like a lifeline. Her voice was soft but firm, her eyes darting between Victoria and the haze. No issue, Alexander said, his gaze never leaving Victoria. We're simply waiting for our water. Emily nodded quickly. I'll take care of that, she said, hurrying to retrieve the drinks. Victoria stood frozen for a moment longer before retreating once again to the galley. By the time the meal service began, the atmosphere in the cabin was electric with tension. Victoria returned, her professionalism fraying at the edges. She placed their trays down with more force than necessary, her smile now a brittle mask. Enjoy your meal, she said, her tone tight. Camille looked at her plate, then back at Victoria. You know, she said, her voice calm but sharp as glass. It's interesting, you're working so hard to make us uncomfortable, and yet you're the one who seems most unsettled. The words hung in the air, cutting through the noise of the cabin. Victoria's face flushed red, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, her steps hurried, her composure cracking. In the galley, Victoria slammed the clipboard onto the counter, her hands trembling. Who do they think they are? She muttered under her breath. Emily, standing nearby, folded her arms. Passengers, she said simply, just like anyone else. They don't belong here. Victoria snapped, her voice rising. You can see it. They don't act like first-class passengers. Emily's eyes narrowed. And what exactly does a first-class passenger act like? Victoria opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. Instead, she turned away, her frustration bubbling over. Back in their seats, Alexander and Camille exchanged a glance. The storm was brewing, and they both knew it wasn't over. This is just the beginning, Camille said softly. Alexander nodded, his expression unreadable. Let her play her hand. Then we'll show ours. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, bathing first class in a soft, muted glow. For most passengers, it was a signal to relax, to sink into the plush leather seats and let the monotony of air travel carry them to their destination. But for Alexander and Camille Hayes, the stillness was deceptive. Tension coiled around them, tighter with each passing moment. Like a storm gathering force. Camille sat poised, her fingers resting lightly on the tray table. Her expression composed but her eyes unflinching. Across the aisle, a man adjusted his watch for the third time, stealing glances their way. Nearby, a couple whispered quietly, their words lost to the hum of the engines but their intent clear. The Hayes could feel it all, the silent judgments, the unspoken questions, the thinly veiled curiosity that had grown sharper with every interaction. "Do you ever wonder," Camille said softly, her voice barely audible above the drone, "if they think we're some kind of anomaly? Like they can't reconcile what they see with what they believe?" Alexander didn't look at her, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "It's not as they see," he replied evenly. "It's what they've been taught to expect." The calm rhythm of their conversation was interrupted as Victoria appeared again, moving down the aisle with purpose. Her clipboard was gone, but her expression was sharper now, her steps quicker. She stopped beside their seats, her arms crossed over her neatly pressed uniform. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," she began, her tone clipped but laced with false politeness. "I need to address something before we proceed with the remainder of the flight." Camille leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Proceed with what, exactly?" Victoria hesitated for only a moment, her mask of professionalism beginning to slip. "There are certain protocols we adhere to in first class," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw attention. "I've noticed some irregularities." The tension in the cabin thickened, the hum of whispered conversations growing quieter as passengers leaned in to listen. Camille tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Irregularities," she repeated. "Such as?" Victoria faltered, but only briefly. "Such as an apparent unfamiliarity with first-class procedures. It's unusual, and I have to ensure." "You have to ensure what?" Alexander cut in, his voice low and steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. He turned to face her fully now, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "That we're supposed to be here? That we belong?" Victoria flushed, but her chin lifted defiantly. "I'm simply doing my job." "And what exactly is your job, Ms. Adams?" Camille asked, her tone deceptively calm. "To protect first-class passengers from people who don't fit your expectations." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. A ripple of unease moved through the cabin. Across the aisle, the man with the watch coughed uncomfortably, and the couple nearby shifted in their seats, their whispers silenced. Victoria's composure cracked further. "I don't believe this is appropriate," she said, her voice tightening. "If there's an issue, I'll escalate it to the captain." Camille leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on Victoria's. "You already escalated it," she said quietly, but the steel in her voice was unmistakable. "The moment you decided we didn't belong here." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps interrupted her. Emily, the younger flight attendant, appeared at the edge of the aisle, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet determination. "Victoria," she said softly, but there was an undercurrent of firmness in her tone. "Can I have a word with you in the galley?" Victoria stiffened, her jaw clenching. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of refusing, but something in Emily's gaze gave her pause. Without another word, she turned and strode down the aisle, her steps clipped and angry. In the galley, Victoria paced back and forth, her frustration spilling over. "They're making a mockery of this cabin," she snapped, her voice low but heated. "You can feel it. Everyone can feel it." Emily crossed her arms, her voice measured. "What I feel," she said evenly, "is that you're letting your assumptions cloud your judgment." Victoria stopped, turning to face her. "My judgment is fine," she retorted. "I know what I see." "Do you?" Emily asked, her voice soft but pointed. "Because what I see is a couple who hasn't done a single thing wrong. They've been polite, quiet, and dignified more than I can say for some of the passengers you're bending over backward to accommodate." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand." "No," Emily said firmly, stepping closer. "You don't understand, and if you don't stop this now, you're going to regret it." Back in their seats, Alexander and Camille sat in silence, their expressions calm but their bodies tense. Camille's hand rested lightly on Alexander's arm, a silent gesture of solidarity. "She's not done," Alexander said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "No," Camille agreed, her gaze fixed ahead. But neither are we. The calm didn't last. Victoria returned, her expression now a mask of forced composure. She addressed them with exaggerated politeness, her voice louder than necessary. "I'll need to verify your identification," she announced, holding out her hand. Camille's brow arched. "Our identification?" she repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. "Yes," Victoria said, her tone clipped. "For security purposes." Alexander leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And what, exactly, do you expect to find?" The question caught Victoria off guard. But she recovered quickly. "It's standard procedure," she said stiffly. "For us," Camille said, her voice soft but cutting. "Not for anyone else in this cabin." The murmurs began again, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled over, spilling into the air like smoke. It was Alexander who broke the moment. Reaching into his blazer pocket, slowly, deliberately, he withdrew a sleek black card and held it out to Victoria. Her eyes darted to it, confusion flickering across her face. "That," Alexander said, his voice steady, "is my identification as the CEO of Horizon Airlines. And this," he gestured to Camille, "is Camille Hayes, CFO of the same company." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria froze, her hand hovering in the air, her face draining of color. Around the cabin, the murmurs grew louder, disbelief rippling through the passengers. "I suggest," Camille said, her voice icy, "that you think very carefully about what you say next." Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she turned and fled to the galley, her composure shattered. As the cabin settled into a stunned silence, Alexander leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Camille reached for his hand, her grip firm. "It's not over," she said quietly. "No," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "But now, everyone's watching." The tension in the first-class cabin hung in the air like a storm cloud, crackling with unspoken words and mounting unease. The other passengers, once absorbed in their devices or conversations, were now wholly engaged in the drama unfolding before them. Every stolen glance, every whispered exchange seemed to ask the same question: what happens next? Camille sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. But Alexander, beside her, leaned back slightly, his gaze steady and fixed on the aisle. He wasn't looking for Victoria. He knew she'd return. It was just a matter of when and how far she was willing to go. In the galley, Victoria's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the counter. Her face was flushed, her mind racing. She felt exposed, humiliated, and worst of all, powerless. The weight of Alexander's calm authority and Camille's piercing words bore down on her, eroding the confidence she'd always carried like armor. "They're manipulating this whole situation," she muttered under her breath, as if saying it aloud would make it true. "Victoria," Emily's voice came from behind her, soft but firm. "You need to stop." Victoria spun around, her eyes flashing. "You don't understand." "No," Emily interrupted, stepping closer. "You don't understand. You're not protecting anything right now. You're making it worse." For a moment, Victoria faltered, her shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of Emily's words. But then her pride surged, hot and blinding. "I'm doing my job," she snapped, her voice rising. "And if you can't see that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Emily recoiled, her lips pressing into a tight line. She took a deep breath, then turned and walked away without another word. Victoria stood alone, her chest heaving, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She knew she was losing control of the situation, of herself, but she couldn't stop now. If she backed down, it would feel like admitting something she wasn't ready to face. Back in the cabin, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to cruising altitude. It was a routine announcement, one that should have calmed the atmosphere. But in the aftermath of Alexander's revelation, routine was impossible. An older woman in the front row leaned toward her husband, whispering loud enough to be heard by everyone around her. "I can't believe they're the executives. Who would have thought?" Her husband frowned. "It shouldn't matter," he said, though his tone carried a note of uncertainty. "They're passengers, same as anyone else." "Is that what you really think?" the woman asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I don't see anyone else being questioned like this." Victoria reappeared, her steps slower now, as if each one carried the weight of her fraying composure. She stood in the aisle, her eyes darting between the haze and the other passengers, who watched her like an audience at the climax of a play. "I need to speak with the captain," she said finally. Her voice clipped. "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding." Camille turned to look at her, her expression one of calm disbelief. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "You mean the one you created?" Victoria flinched at the words. But she pressed on. "I'll let the captain decide what happens next." "By all means," Alexander said, his voice like a knife gliding through silk. "Bring him here. Let's settle this now." The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. And for a moment, Victoria seemed to consider retreating. But her pride won out. She turned sharply and headed for the cockpit, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. Minutes passed. The cabin was silent except for the hum of the engines. Alexander sat motionless, his gaze distant but focused. Camille tapped her fingers lightly on her armrest, her only outward sign of unease. Finally, the cockpit door opened, and the captain emerged. He was a tall man with graying hair, his uniform immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. He glanced briefly at Victoria, who stood to the side, her face pale but defiant. Then he approached the Hayes. His steps measured. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice steady. "I understand there's been some confusion." "No confusion," Camille replied smoothly. "Just a very clear display of bias." The captain's expression flickered, a shadow of discomfort crossing his face. "Victoria has raised some concerns." "Concerns?" Alexander interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Based on what, exactly? Our seats? Our clothes? Or simply the fact that we don't fit her preconceived idea of who should be sitting here?" The captain hesitated, glancing around the cabin. He could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze, their judgment pressing down on him. "I can assure you, Horizon Airlines does not tolerate discrimination," he said finally. "We'll address this matter thoroughly." Camille leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Address it how? By sweeping it under the rug until the next time it happens?" The captain opened his mouth to respond. But Alexander spoke first. "This isn't just about us," he said, his tone measured but unyielding. "It's about the culture you've allowed to take root on your flights. If you think this ends with an apology and a promise to do better, you're mistaken." The captain straightened, his discomfort giving way to a flicker of respect. "Understood," he said quietly. "I'll speak with Victoria and take immediate action." "You'll do more than that," Camille said, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "You'll ensure that every passenger and every employee understands that this kind of behavior has no place here." Victoria stood frozen as the captain approached her, his expression grim. "Victoria," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." She started to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their judgment and disdain like a weight she couldn't escape. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done, not just to the Hayes, but to herself. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Passengers whispered to one another, their voices tinged with a mix of shame and curiosity. A man across the aisle leaned toward Alexander, his expression apologetic. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, thank you for handling this the way you did." Alexander inclined his head slightly. "It's not just about handling it," he said, "it's about changing it." Camille nodded, her voice soft but firm. "And that change starts with moments like this." In the galley, Victoria sat alone, her hands trembling as she replayed the confrontation in her mind. For the first time, she began to see herself clearly, not as the gatekeeper she thought she was, but as someone who had allowed her assumptions to cloud her judgment. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was one she could no longer avoid. The plane hummed with the steady rhythm of its engines, but the first-class cabin was anything but calm. Conversations had died down, replaced by a tense silence that filled the air like static. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some feigning indifference, others openly observing the scene that had unfolded before them. It was no longer just a confrontation between Victoria and the Hayes, it had become something larger. Something that demanded the attention of everyone on board. Camille adjusted her scarf, her movements precise, her composure unshaken. Alexander sat beside her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, scanning the cabin like a general surveying the battlefield. They both knew the fight was far from over. Victoria had retreated to the galley, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. For all her bravado, she now looked like a woman on the edge of collapse. She leaned against the counter, gripping its edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her thoughts churned, each one heavier than the last. Who do they think they are? She wondered bitterly, but the question rang hollow. And deep down, she knew it wasn't about them. It was about her, about the assumptions she'd carried with her all her life. Assumptions that had been shattered in front of an audience. The captain returned to the Hayes. His demeanor professional but uneasy. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice steady but laced with discomfort. "I want to apologize again for the behavior you've experienced. This is not reflective of the standards we uphold at Horizon Airlines." Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Apologies are only as good as the actions that follow them," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It's about the culture that allows this kind of treatment to go unchecked." The captain nodded, his jaw tightening. "I understand," he said, "and I assure you, this will be addressed at the highest levels." Camille leaned forward slightly, her eyes piercing. "We'll make sure it is." The captain hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, leaving the Hayes to their silence. But the tension in the cabin lingered, like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. In the galley, Emily approached Victoria cautiously, her expression soft but resolute. "Victoria," she said gently, "you need to take a step back." Victoria didn't respond at first. Her eyes were fixed on the counter, her breathing shallow. Finally, she turned to Emily, her voice a whisper. "I was just doing my job." Emily sighed, her frustration tempered by empathy. "No, you weren't," she said. "You were letting your biases do the job for you." Victoria flinched at the words. But she didn't argue. Instead, she sank onto the small fold-down seat, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she muttered. I didn't think." "That's the problem," Emily said softly. "You didn't think, you assumed." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers began to process what they had witnessed. A man in his 60s leaned over to the woman beside him, his voice low but incredulous. "Can you believe this? Treating them like that, and they're the ones running the airline?" The woman shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not just them," she said quietly. "It's everyone who looks like them. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. It's just the first time someone's been called out for it." Across the aisle, a younger man turned to the flight attendant serving drinks. "Is this normal?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Do people get treated like this all the time?" The flight attendant hesitated, her smile faltering. I don't think so," she said weakly, but the doubt in her voice betrayed her. Camille felt the shift in the cabin, the growing unease rippling through the passengers. She leaned toward Alexander, her voice low. "They're starting to see it," she said, "the cracks in the facade." Alexander nodded, his gaze still fixed ahead. "Seeing is one thing," he said, "understanding is another." Victoria emerged from the galley, her steps hesitant, her usual confidence replaced by a fragile determination. She approached the Hayes, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I need to apologize. I realize now that my actions were inappropriate." Camille looked up at her, her expression unreadable. "Inappropriate?" she repeated. "That's an interesting word." Victoria flinched but pressed on. "I was wrong," she said, her voice stronger now. "I let my assumptions guide my actions. And I failed to treat you with the respect you deserve. I'm sorry." The cabin fell silent, every passenger straining to hear the exchange. Alexander regarded Victoria for a long moment, his gaze steady and unyielding. Finally, he spoke. "An apology is a start," he said, "but it's not enough." Victoria nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I understand," she said. "I'll do better." Camille's eyes narrowed slightly. "Doing better isn't about words, Ms. Adams. It's about actions. What you do next will determine whether this moment means something or nothing at all." Victoria swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "I'll make it mean something," she said quietly. As Victoria stepped away, the tension in the cabin began to shift. The whispers grew louder, but now they carried a different tone, one of reflection, of discomfort, of recognition. The passengers weren't just witnessing a moment. They were being forced to confront their own assumptions, their own complicity. An older woman in the front row turned to her husband, her voice quiet but firm. We've been flying for years, she said, and I can't help but wonder how many times we've seen something like this and just looked the other way. Her husband nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it's time we stop looking the other way. In their seats, Camille and Alexander sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. Finally, Camille spoke, her voice soft but steady. Do you think it'll change anything? She asked. Alexander was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. It's a step, he said finally, but it's not the last one. Camille nodded, her hand resting lightly on his. Then we keep going. The plane soared on, carrying with it not just passengers but the weight of a reckoning that had been long overdue. The cabin felt different now, though the engines hummed with the same steady rhythm, and the lights still bathed the space in their golden glow. It was as if everyone aboard could feel the shift, the unspoken truths that had been forced into the open. The silence was no longer a quiet luxury, it was heavy, charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Camille sat upright, her back straight, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. She felt the stares, the weight of judgment and curiosity from every direction. Across the aisle, Alexander's gaze remained fixed ahead, his jaw set, his presence commanding even in his stillness. In the galley, Victoria Adams stood alone. Her reflection in the polished stainless steel of the counter was a version of herself she barely recognized, pale, frazzled, defeated. She had prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to command respect in the air. But now, that carefully curated image lay shattered at her feet. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water. She could still hear Camille's words ringing in her ears. Doing better isn't about words. It's about actions. The phrase cut deeper than any reprimand. Not because it was harsh but because it was true. The captain emerged from the cockpit again, his expression tight. He walked to where Camille and Alexander sat, stopping just short of their row. His presence drew the attention of the entire cabin. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, he began, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation. I've spoken to Victoria, and she's expressed her regret for her actions. I want to assure you that this matter will be handled with the seriousness it deserves once we land. Camille's gaze locked onto his, unwavering. And what does that mean? Exactly? She asked, her voice calm but cutting. Another meeting? A slap on the wrist? Or will it be swept under the rug like so many other incidents? The captain's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. This will not be swept under the rug, he said firmly. We'll conduct a full review and take the necessary steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice low but resonant. Captain, with all due respect, this isn't just about ensuring it doesn't happen again. It's about acknowledging why it happened in the first place. The words hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The captain gave a small nod, then stepped back, retreating to the cockpit. His departure left the cabin buzzing with unspoken tension, a palpable mix of discomfort and reflection. Across the aisle, a man in his 50s finally broke the silence. He leaned toward Alexander, his voice quiet but earnest. Sir, I just want to say, I'm sorry, for what you've been through, for what we've all seen. Alexander turned to him, his expression softening slightly. It's not about apologies, he said, it's about understanding. The man nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. You're right, he said, I've flown a lot of miles, seen a lot of people come and go in these seats. But today made me see things differently. Not everyone was so willing to confront their own biases. Toward the front of the cabin, an older woman whispered sharply to her husband. I don't see why this has to be such a big deal, she said, her voice just loud enough to carry. People get asked questions all the time. Why does it always have to come back to race? Her husband shifted uncomfortably. Maybe because it is about race, he said, his voice hesitant but firm. Maybe because we've ignored it for too long. The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. Victoria remained in the galley, unable to bring herself to return to the cabin. Emily approached her cautiously, her steps light as though she were afraid of startling her. Victoria, Emily said gently, her voice low, you can't stay back here forever. Victoria shook her head, her hands gripping the counter. I can't face them, she whispered. Not after everything. Emily hesitated, then placed a hand on Victoria's shoulder. You made a mistake, she said, but hiding from it won't fix anything. If you want to make it right, you have to face it. Victoria swallowed hard, her throat tight. What if I can't? She asked, her voice trembling. Emily's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly. Then nothing changes, she said simply. And isn't that what got us here in the first place? As the plane continued its journey, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The tension no longer felt like a storm ready to break but like the heavy, lingering aftermath of a confrontation that had left everyone raw and exposed. Camille turned to Alexander, her voice low but steady. Do you think they'll actually do something this time? She asked. Alexander was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. I don't know, he admitted, but they can't ignore it now. Not after this. Camille nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's never just about one person. Is it? She said softly. It's about the whole system. The culture. Alexander reached over, his hand resting lightly on hers. And the people willing to fight to change it, he said. In the final hours of the flight, Victoria returned to the cabin. Her steps were slow, hesitant, and her face was pale. But there was a flicker of resolve in her eyes. She stopped beside the Hayes row, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, she began, her voice trembling but audible. I know words aren't enough. But I want you to know I'm sorry. For everything. For how I treated you. For the assumptions I made. Camille looked up at her, her gaze piercing. What are you going to do about it? She asked. Victoria blinked, caught off guard. I'll do better, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Doing better starts with action, Camille said, not just promises. Are you ready to act? Victoria swallowed hard, her hands trembling, but then she nodded, her chin lifting slightly. Yes, she said, her voice firmer now. I am. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense but tinged with something new, a quiet, tentative hope. The passengers who had watched silently now seemed to carry the weight of the moment with them. Their expressions thoughtful, their whispers softer. Camille and Alexander exchanged a glance as the wheels touched down, the runway rushing beneath them. It's not over, Camille said quietly. No, Alexander agreed, but it's a start. The plane touched down with a jarring thud, the cabin shaking as the wheels screeched against the tarmac. The abruptness of the landing seemed to mirror the unresolved tension in the air. Passengers straightened in their seats, stowing away books and tablets, their movements stiff, their silence heavy. The customary applause from relieved travelers was notably absent. Instead, there was a collective holding of breath, a sense that something crucial had shifted mid-flight and had yet to settle. Camille Hayes glanced at her husband, her eyes scanning his face for signs of fatigue. Alexander sat motionless, his hands folded on his lap, his expression stoic, but she knew him well enough to recognize the simmering anger beneath his calm exterior, a quiet, smoldering fire he reserved for moments when the stakes were highest. Ready? She asked softly. Always, he replied, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it, a weight that suggested this landing was only the beginning of a confrontation still to come. As the passengers began to disembark, the first-class cabin remained unusually quiet. Even the more privileged travelers seemed reluctant to speak, their usual sense of entitlement dampened by the events of the flight. The whispers that had carried through the cabin earlier were gone, replaced by furtive glances and tight-lipped expressions. Near the galley, Victoria Adams stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall. Her polished uniform felt constricting now, like a costume she no longer fit into. Emily hovered nearby, her face a mixture of concern and resolve. She watched Victoria, waiting for her to speak, but the words didn't come. You can't avoid them forever, Emily said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Victoria shook her head, her hands gripping the counter behind her. I don't know what to say, she whispered. What can I say? Try the truth, Emily replied, stepping closer. It's the least you can do. In the terminal, the tension followed the passengers like a shadow. The crowd thinned as people rushed to catch connecting flights or hurried toward baggage claim. But in the first-class lounge, a small group lingered, employees in crisp suits, their faces tight with worry. They were waiting for Alexander and Camille. As the couple stepped off the jet bridge, the group approached, their leader a man in his 40s with neatly combed hair and a forced smile extending a hand. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice overly formal. Mark Reynolds, head of public relations, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. Camille ignored his hand, her gaze sharp. And what, exactly, are you apologizing for, Mr. Reynolds? She asked. Her tone as smooth as silk but carrying the weight of steel. Reynolds hesitated, his smile faltering. For the misunderstanding on the flight. He said weakly, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. Alexander's lips curved into a humorless smile. Do you? He asked. Because from where we were sitting, it didn't look like anyone was taking anything seriously until it became impossible to ignore. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but Camille cut him off. This isn't a misunderstanding, she said sharply. This is a systemic issue. It's about culture, about assumptions, about what you've allowed to go unchecked for far too long. Behind them, Victoria stepped into the terminal. Her steps hesitant, she stopped short when she saw the group, her breath catching in her throat. The sight of Alexander and Camille standing tall, commanding the attention of the entire room, made her stomach churn with both guilt and awe. Emily nudged her forward. Now's your chance, she whispered. Victoria swallowed hard and took a shaky step forward. The group turned to face her, their expressions ranging from surprise to thinly veiled disdain. But it was Camille's gaze that struck her the hardest, calm, piercing, and unrelenting. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Victoria began, her voice trembling. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly, I know that what I did was wrong. And I want to make it right. Camille crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. And how do you plan to do that? Victoria hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for the right words. I don't know yet, she admitted finally. But I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. The silence that followed was deafening. Camille and Alexander exchanged a glance. A silent conversation passing between them. You have a lot to learn, Alexander said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. And it won't be easy. Victoria nodded quickly, her eyes brimming with tears. I understand, she said, and I'll do the work. I promise. The group dispersed, leaving Alexander and Camille to make their way to the exit. As they walked, Camille let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Do you think she'll follow through? She asked. Alexander was quiet for a moment before replying. I think she wants to, he said. Whether she does or not depends on what she's willing to face. Camille nodded, her expression thoughtful. And the others? She asked, glancing back at the terminal. The ones who watched, who stayed silent. Do you think they'll change? Alexander's gaze was distant, his voice steady. Some will, some won't, but they can't unsee what happened today. And that's a start. As they stepped into the crisp evening air, the world outside seemed to hum with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the storm that had unfolded at 35,000 feet. But for Alexander and Camille, the journey was far from over. This was just one battle in a much larger fight, one that wouldn't end until the skies and the world below became a place where everyone was truly equal. It's not enough, Camille said softly, her voice carrying a quiet determination. No, Alexander agreed, but it's a beginning, and that's something. The conference room was a battlefield of a different kind, where words were weapons and silence often carried the heaviest blows. The space, sleek and modern with its glass walls and steel accents, was designed to exude authority and control. But on this particular morning, it felt as though the air itself were pressing down on everyone seated around the polished table. Alexander and Camille Hayes sat at one end, their presence unshakable. Their calm was not the calm of concession but of clarity and knowing, quiet that had been earned through years of navigating spaces where their very existence was questioned. Across from them sat the senior leadership of Horizon Airlines, executives in sharp suits, their faces tight with discomfort. At the head of the table was Mark Reynolds, his practiced smile absent now, replaced by an expression of barely concealed unease. Beside him sat Evelyn Carter, the head of Human Resources, whose pen tapped against her notebook as if trying to punctuate her own nervous energy. Alexander glanced around the room, his gaze landing on each face in turn. We're here, he began, his voice steady but commanding. Because what happened on Flight 298 wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, a culture that tolerates bias, whether overt or subtle. Mark shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. We recognize that this incident was unacceptable, and we're committed to addressing it, he said quickly. We've already begun reviewing our policies. It's not about policies, Camille interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut through the room. Policies don't mean anything if the culture doesn't change. This isn't about what's written on paper. It's about what happens when people think they can act on their biases without consequence. Evelyn leaned forward, her brow furrowed. With all due respect, Mrs. Hayes, changing culture is a long process. It requires buy-in at every level of the organization. And what have you done to get that buy-in? Camille shot back. What have you done to make it clear that this behavior won't be tolerated? The room fell silent, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. At that moment, the door to the conference room opened, and Victoria Adams stepped inside. Her presence drew every eye, the tension in the room thickening instantly. She looked different now, her posture less rigid, her face pale but resolute. She carried herself not with the confidence of authority but with the vulnerability of someone who had been forced to confront herself. "Thank you for allowing me to be here," Victoria said, her voice steady but soft. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I asked to join this meeting because I felt it was important for me to take responsibility not just for what happened on the flight, but for what it represents." Camille leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. "And what do you think it represents?" she asked. Victoria hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It represents the assumptions I've carried with me," she said finally. "Assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. About who belongs where, about who deserves what. And it's not just me. It's the environment I've worked in, the culture we've all been a part of." Alexander's gaze remained fixed on her, his voice calm but pointed. "And what are you prepared to do about it?" Victoria swallowed hard. "I'm prepared to do the work," she said. "To confront my own biases. To listen. To learn. And to help others do the same." Evelyn cleared her throat, her expression cautious. "Victoria, I appreciate your honesty," she said, "but this is a larger issue. One person's willingness to change isn't going to fix the systemic problems we're facing. Then start by making it more than just one person," Camille said firmly. "You have the power to set the tone, to hold people accountable, to show that this isn't just about avoiding bad PR, it's about building a workplace and a company that actually reflect the values you claim to stand for." The conversation grew more heated as the morning wore on, the tension in the room rising with every exchanged word. Mark attempted to steer the discussion toward logistics, citing training programs and new policies. But Camille wouldn't let him off the hook. "What you're describing is damage control," she said, "not accountability, not change." "And what do you suggest?" Mark asked, his frustration beginning to show. "What's the solution?" "The solution," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the noise, "is to stop looking for easy answers. This isn't something you fix with a few workshops and a press release. It's about reevaluating everything: your hiring practices, your training, the way you handle complaints. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe speaking up, where they know they'll be heard. And it starts with leadership." Camille added, "If the people at the top aren't willing to lead by example, nothing else will matter." By the time the meeting ended, the room was heavy with both exhaustion and determination. Mark Reynolds looked visibly drained, but there was a flicker of resolve in his eyes. Evelyn Carter's pen had stopped tapping, her notebook filled with notes and questions she hadn't yet voiced. Victoria approached Alexander and Camille as the others began to leave. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for holding me accountable, for not letting me hide from this." Camille regarded her for a long moment before nodding. "Accountability is the first step," she said. "The real work starts now." As Alexander and Camille left the building, the sun shone brightly overhead, a stark contrast to the weight of the discussions they had just endured. Camille slipped her arm through Alexander's, her voice quiet. "Do you think they'll follow through?" she asked. "I think some of them will," Alexander replied. "And the ones who don't, we'll make sure they have to." Camille smiled faintly. "The skies are a long way from being fair," she said, "but at least we're starting to clear the clouds." Alexander nodded, his gaze fixed ahead, one flight at a time. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the city in hues of amber and gold. From the window of Horizon Airlines headquarters, the skyline stretched like a mosaic of ambition and resilience. Camille Hayes stood by the glass, her reflection merging with the view outside. Behind her, The room buzzed with subdued activity, executives murmuring, pens scratching against paper, and the faint hum of a conference call. But it was the silence between the words, the unspoken weight of what had been set in motion, that resonated most. "Do you think they understand now?" Camille asked, turning to face Alexander. Her voice was measured, but her eyes carried the weight of the day. Alexander, seated at the head of the table, leaned back in his chair. His expression was calm, but his hands, clasped tightly in his lap, betrayed the tension simmering beneath. "Understanding is a process," he said, "and processes take time. What matters is that the wheels are turning." Across the table, Evelyn Carter shuffled her notes, clearing her throat before speaking. "We've started drafting a comprehensive plan," she said. "Mandatory diversity training, revised hiring practices, a task force to address complaints more effectively. But it won't work if people see it as a box to check." Camille finished for her, her tone sharp. "This isn't just about policies, Evelyn. It's about culture. And culture doesn't change unless people are willing to do the hard work." Mark Reynolds, seated beside Evelyn, sighed heavily. "Hard work," he repeated, almost to himself. "The thing is, Mrs. Hayes, people don't like being told they have biases. It makes them defensive, resistant." "Good," Alexander said simply. The word landed like a stone in the room, the weight of it undeniable. "Let them feel defensive. Let them feel uncomfortable. That's the point." The following week, the first diversity training session took place. It was held in a plain conference room on the 12th floor. A stark contrast to the sleek elegance of Horizon's usual meeting spaces. The chairs were arranged in a circle, and the whiteboard at the front bore the words, "Understanding bias, building bridges, not walls." Victoria Adams sat near the back, her posture stiff, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had agreed to participate, though every fiber of her being had resisted. The shame of her actions on Flight 298 still burned. But it was no longer a searing, paralyzing heat. It had cooled into something else, something that demanded reckoning. The facilitator, a woman named Lila with a calm yet commanding presence, began by inviting everyone to introduce themselves. When it was Victoria's turn, her voice wavered, but she forced herself to speak. "My name is Victoria Adams," she said, her gaze fixed on her hands. "I'm a flight attendant, and I'm here because I made a mistake. A big one. I let my biases guide my actions, and I hurt people because of it." The room was silent. Victoria forced herself to look up, her eyes meeting those of her colleagues. Some looked uncomfortable, others sympathetic, but none looked away. "Thank you for sharing," Lila said, her tone warm but firm. "Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward change. But the real work begins with understanding why we made them." The discussion that followed was raw and unflinching. Employees shared their experiences, times they had felt excluded, times they had been complicit in exclusion. A mechanic spoke about how his thick accent often led to assumptions about his competence. A junior executive recounted the subtle but persistent microaggressions she faced as a woman of color in a male-dominated field. When it came time for Victoria to speak again, she hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I thought I was doing my job," she said finally. "I thought I was protecting the integrity of first class. But the truth is, I was protecting my own assumptions. And those assumptions were wrong." Emily, seated across from her, offered a small, encouraging smile. "You're not the only one," she said. "We've all been shaped by this system. But if we don't question it, we're just letting it win." Meanwhile, Alexander and Camille worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pushing for systemic changes that went beyond the training sessions. They met with department heads, reviewed complaints, and established new accountability measures. But progress was slow, and resistance lingered. "Some people think we're overreacting," Evelyn admitted during one meeting. "They think this is just a PR move." "It's not," Camille said firmly. "And if they think that, it's because they're not ready to face the truth." Alexander leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "Change isn't about convincing everyone to agree. It's about creating a system where the right thing becomes the norm, not the exception. People can resist all they want, but they'll adapt or they'll leave." As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of their efforts began to show. Complaints about bias decreased, employee engagement improved, and new hires reflected a broader spectrum of backgrounds and experiences. But the work was far from done. Victoria, now a vocal participant in the training sessions, found herself grappling with the deeper implications of her actions. She began mentoring newer flight attendants, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale but as a testament to the possibility of growth. "I'm not proud of what I did," she told one trainee, "but I'm proud of what I've learned. And I want to help you see what I couldn't before." One afternoon, Alexander and Camille visited a training session unannounced. They stood at the back of the room, listening as employees shared their experiences and insights. When the session ended, Victoria approached them hesitantly. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," she began, her voice quiet but steady. I wanted to thank you for holding me accountable, for giving me the chance to be better." Camille regarded her for a long moment before nodding. "Accountability is where change begins," she said, "but the choice to keep going, that's yours." Victoria nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "I won't stop," she said, "I promise." As Alexander and Camille left the building that evening, the city was bathed in the soft light of dusk. The air was cool, and the distant hum of traffic filled the silence between them. "Do you think it's enough?" Camille asked quietly. Alexander was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's never enough," he said finally, "but it's a start." Camille slipped her arm through his, her grip firm. "Then we keep going," she said, and together, they walked forward, their steps steady, their resolve unshakable. The sound of applause rippled across the conference hall, faint and obligatory, as the Horizon Airlines annual leadership summit came to a close. Executives shuffled out of their seats, their faces tight with the weight of a long day. But for Alexander and Camille Hayes, seated in the back row, the day's end signaled something far more significant, a moment of truth, where words would give way to action or fall flat under the weight of their promises. "It's been months," Camille said softly, her voice a calm undercurrent beneath the noise of departing attendees. "And yet, every step forward feels like dragging a boulder uphill." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Change isn't linear," he replied, his voice carrying the weariness of hard-earned wisdom. "It's a fight, and the real fight hasn't even started." That fight arrived the following week, unannounced and unrelenting. On the surface, it seemed like a routine flight. Flight 402, bound for Seattle, carried a mix of business travelers, vacationing families, and first-class regulars who viewed the skies as an extension of their privilege. But among them was a passenger whose presence would test everything Horizon Airlines had claimed to learn since Flight 298, an elderly black man in a worn suit, seated quietly in first class. From the moment he boarded, the tension was palpable. A man 2 rows back whispered to his seatmate, his voice low but pointed, "Think he got upgraded?" Another passenger, a woman with designer luggage, narrowed her eyes as the man placed his well-used briefcase under the seat in front of him. The flight attendants, including Victoria Adams, still rebuilding her career after the incident, moved through the cabin with forced politeness. But beneath their smiles, the cracks were showing. Victoria's gaze lingered too long on the elderly man's boarding pass, her lips tightening as she handed it back. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone neutral but devoid of warmth. Camille and Alexander, seated inconspicuously at the back of first class as part of their ongoing undercover assessments, exchanged a glance. Camille's eyes flicked toward the elderly man, then back to Alexander. "Do you see it?" she murmured. "Of course," Alexander replied, his jaw tightening. "The question is, how far will it go this time?" It didn't take long to find out. Shortly after takeoff, Victoria approached the man with a clipboard in hand, her demeanor stiff. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw attention from nearby passengers. "May I see your ticket again?" The man, startled, fumbled briefly before handing over his boarding pass. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but weary. "No problem," Victoria said, though her expression betrayed her uncertainty. "Just a routine check." Camille's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Routine," she whispered, her tone sharp with disdain. Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Let's see where this goes." Victoria returned the ticket after an excruciating pause, her smile brittle. "Everything seems to be in order," she said, though her tone implied otherwise. She turned sharply, her retreat back to the galley a clear attempt to escape the weight of her actions. The whispers began almost immediately. Must be some kind of mistake. One passenger muttered. He doesn't exactly scream first class. Another added, their words dripping with derision. Camille had heard enough. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Her movements graceful but deliberate. The cabin fell silent as she walked to the elderly man's row. Her presence commanding attention without a single word. "Sir," she said gently, addressing the man, "is everything all right?" He looked up at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "I suppose so," he said softly. "Just seems some people have questions about my place here." Camille smiled faintly, the warmth in her expression belying the fire in her eyes. "Your place here is exactly where it should be," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the cabin. Turning, she faced the rest of first class, her gaze sweeping over the passengers who had watched, whispered, and judged. "And if anyone here disagrees," she added, her tone razor sharp, "they're welcome to take it up with me." The silence was deafening. In the galley, Victoria paced nervously, her mind racing. She knew Camille's words were directed at the entire cabin, but they felt like a personal indictment. Emily, standing nearby, watched her with a mix of concern and disappointment. "Victoria," Emily said finally, her tone soft but firm, "you've worked too hard to let this happen again." Victoria stopped, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I didn't mean for it to escalate," she said weakly. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Emily asked, her voice sharp now. "That he belonged? That his ticket was valid? Or that your bias was showing again?" Victoria flinched, the words hitting like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond but found no defense. No excuse that could hold up under the weight of the truth. Back in the cabin, the tension had shifted. Passengers who had whispered before now looked down. Avoiding Camille's gaze, the elderly man sat straighter, his dignity reclaimed, though the lines of weariness on his face remained. Alexander joined Camille, standing at her side. "You've made your point," he said quietly. "Now let's make sure it sticks." Camille nodded, her resolve unshaken. She turned to Victoria, who had returned to the cabin with hesitant steps, her expression a mixture of shame and determination. "Ms. Adams," Camille said, her voice calm but unyielding, "I think you owe this gentleman an apology." Victoria froze, her face pale. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. But then she stepped forward, her voice trembling but audible. "Sir," she said, addressing the man directly, "I'm sorry for questioning you, for making you feel unwelcome. That wasn't my intention. But I see now that it doesn't matter what I intended. What matters is what I did." The man regarded her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said simply. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in first class began to shift. The whispers stopped, the stares faded, and for the first time, the cabin felt like a space where everyone regardless of their appearance could exist without question. When the plane landed, Camille and Alexander waited as passengers disembarked, watching as Victoria lingered near the exit, her posture less rigid, her expression more open. "You took a step today," Camille said quietly as they passed her. "Now take another." Victoria nodded, her voice steady this time. "I will." Later that evening, as Alexander and Camille walked through the quiet streets of the city, the weight of the day settled over them. The fight for change was far from over. But in that moment, there was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that progress, no matter how slow, was still progress. "Do you think it'll ever stop?" Camille asked softly. The whispers, the stares, the questions? Alexander slipped his arm through hers, his grip firm. "Not overnight," he said, "but one day, one flight at a time." Camille smiled faintly, the warmth of his words carrying them forward. Together, they walked on, their steps steady, their resolve unbreakable. The boardroom at Horizon Airlines headquarters was a space of sharp angles and gleaming surfaces. It was designed to impress, to remind everyone who entered of the company's reach and power. But today, the polished veneer could not conceal the tension simmering within. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that precedes an unavoidable reckoning. Alexander Hayes sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding even in stillness. Camille sat beside him, her composure a contrast to the storm that brewed beneath her calm exterior. Across from them sat the company's senior leadership team, their faces drawn, their usual confidence replaced by unease. "This isn't just about a few incidents," Alexander began, his voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. This is about the culture we've allowed to fester, one that thrives on assumptions, excuses, and silence. Mark Reynolds, the head of public relations, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We've implemented new policies, he said, his tone defensive. We've introduced mandatory training, revised our protocols. And yet, the same patterns persist. Camille interrupted, her voice sharp. Policies are meaningless without accountability. And accountability starts at the top. Evelyn Carter, the head of human resources, leaned forward, her pen tapping against her notebook. What are you proposing? She asked cautiously. We've already taken significant steps. What more can we do? Alexander's gaze swept the room, his eyes meeting each executive in turn. We dismantle the systems that perpetuate these behaviors, he said. We create new ones, and we hold every single person, ourselves included, responsible for the culture we claim to uphold. As the meeting continued, the tension escalated. Voices rose and fell, arguments clashing like waves against a rocky shore. Camille's voice cut through the noise, each word deliberate, her tone unwavering. This isn't just about Horizon Airlines, she said. It's about what we represent. When we let bias go unchecked, when we allow moments of discrimination to pass without consequence, we send a message to every passenger, every employee, every person who looks to us for leadership. And that message is, you don't belong here. The words landed heavily, silencing the room. Evelyn stopped tapping her pen. Mark looked down at his hands. For a moment, all that could be heard was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Outside the boardroom, in a small training session on the 12th floor, Victoria Adams stood before a group of new flight attendants. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her name tag, but her voice was steady as she spoke. When I started this job, I thought I understood what it meant to serve, she began. I thought it was about efficiency, about following the rules, but I've learned that serving means more than that. It means seeing people, not just their tickets, not just their clothes, but their humanity. The room was quiet, the new hires listening intently. Victoria's gaze swept over them, her expression earnest. I failed at that once, she continued. I let my biases blind me, and it took someone calling me out, holding me accountable, to make me see the truth. A young man in the front row raised his hand. How did you move forward? He asked. Victoria hesitated, her hands tightening on the podium. By facing it, she said. By listening, learning, and choosing every day to do better. And by remembering that it's not just about me. It's about the people I serve. It's about the trust they place in me. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, the meeting had reached its boiling point. Evelyn stood, her voice rising as she addressed Alexander and Camille. You're asking us to rebuild this company from the ground up, she said, to question everything we've built, everything we've relied on. Do you realize how disruptive that will be? Camille rose to her feet, her expression fierce. Do you realize how disruptive it is to live with the constant question of whether you belong? She countered. Do you know what it's like to walk into a space and feel the weight of every assumption? Every whisper, every sideways glance? Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Evelyn sat down slowly, her face pale. Around the table, the other executives shifted, their discomfort palpable. Alexander stood, his voice calm but resonant. We're not asking you to tear this company down, he said. We're asking you to build it up stronger, fairer, better. That's the only way forward. Later that evening, Alexander and Camille sat in their shared office, the city skyline glowing behind them. The weight of the day pressed heavily on them, but there was a spark of determination in their eyes. They're scared, Camille said quietly. Scared of losing control, scared of what change will cost them. Good, Alexander replied. Fear is where growth begins. It forces you to confront the things you'd rather ignore. Camille leaned back, her gaze distant. Do you think they'll follow through? She asked. Alexander was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. Some will, he said, and the ones who don't? They'll have to face the consequences. The next morning, the changes began. A company-wide email announced the formation of a new equity and accountability task force, led by Camille herself. Mandatory training sessions were expanded, and anonymous reporting channels were established for employees and passengers alike. But most importantly, leadership evaluations now included metrics on inclusivity and fairness measured not by policies, but by actions. Victoria, now a vocal advocate for change, was invited to join the task force. She accepted with a mix of trepidation and resolve, knowing that her journey was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, the resistance grew louder. Employees grumbled about the new measures, claiming they were unnecessary or performative. Some executives pushed back, arguing that the focus on equity was detracting from profits. But Alexander and Camille remained steadfast, their vision unwavering. "This isn't about making people comfortable," Alexander said during one meeting. "It's about making things right." By the end of the month, the first major test of Horizon Airlines' new approach arrived. A passenger complaint alleging racial profiling by a gate agent. The response was swift and transparent. The incident was investigated thoroughly, the findings shared with employees, and the gate agent was held accountable. For the first time, Horizon Airlines wasn't just reacting to a problem, it was setting a precedent. One evening, as Camille and Alexander walked through the terminal after a long day, they passed a group of passengers boarding a flight. Among them was a young black woman with a toddler in tow, her smile radiant as she stepped into the first-class cabin. Camille watched her go, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Do you think she feels it?" she asked softly. "That she belongs?" Alexander slipped his arm through hers, his gaze steady. "If she doesn't now," he said, "she will soon." And together, they walked on, carrying the weight of the fight but also the hope of what was still to come. The auditorium hummed with anticipation. Rows of employees, journalists, and community leaders filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the stage where Horizon Airlines' emblem hung against a backdrop of soft lights. The event, billed as a cultural transformation summit, was a culmination of months of intense scrutiny, bold decisions, and uncomfortable reckonings. It was both a celebration and a challenge, a moment for Horizon to publicly declare not just what it had done, but what it still needed to do. In the front row sat Alexander and Camille Hayes, their hands resting on their laps, their expressions calm but resolute. This was not a victory lap. They knew better than anyone that the work of change was never finished. But it was a milestone, a chance to reflect on the battles fought and the path ahead. As the CEO of Horizon Airlines took the stage, the room quieted. His speech was carefully written, each word calibrated to convey humility and commitment. Yet, as he began to speak, it became clear that the weight of this moment extended far beyond the corporate realm. It reached into the hearts of everyone present, touching nerves long buried and fears long ignored. The CEO cleared his throat, his voice steady but measured. "When we began this journey, we thought we were addressing an incident, a single flight, a single mistake. But what we've come to understand is that Flight 298 was not an anomaly. It was a mirror or reflection of the biases, the inequities, and the blind spots that exist not just in our company but in society at large." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "We are not here today to declare that we've fixed everything. We're here to acknowledge the hard truth, that the work of equity and justice is never complete. It requires vigilance, it requires courage, and most of all, it requires all of us." The applause that followed was polite but subdued. The audience wasn't here for platitudes, they wanted substance. They wanted proof. Victoria Adams sat toward the back of the auditorium, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The months since Flight 298 had been some of the most challenging of her life. But they had also been transformative. She had attended every training session, confronted her biases head-on, and joined the Equity and Accountability Task Force. Today, she would speak publicly about her journey for the first time. When her name was called, Victoria stood slowly, her palms damp with nervous sweat. The walk to the stage felt endless, each step a reminder of the weight she carried not just for herself, but for everyone watching, everyone waiting to see if redemption was possible. Standing at the podium, Victoria took a deep breath. The room blurred slightly as she looked out at the crowd, but she forced herself to focus. She owed them honesty. "My name is Victoria Adams," she began, her voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. "And I am here because I made a mistake that hurt people, that violated the trust placed in me as a representative of this airline, and that reflected the biases I carried without even realizing it." She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. "For a long time, I told myself that my intentions were what mattered, that I didn't mean to hurt anyone, that I was just doing my job. But the truth is, intentions don't matter if the impact is harm. And the impact of my actions on Flight 298 was harm. Victoria's voice grew stronger, her words more deliberate. What I've learned since that day is that bias isn't always loud. It doesn't always look like outright hatred. Sometimes, it's quiet, subtle. It's the hesitation before a smile, the doubt before a greeting. It's the assumptions we carry without questioning, the choices we make without reflection. She leaned forward slightly, her voice now firm and clear. But bias can be unlearned. Assumptions can be challenged. And change is possible not just for individuals, but for entire systems. That's why I'm here, to show that the journey of change is messy. It's uncomfortable, and it's never ending, but it's worth it. When Victoria stepped back from the podium, the applause was thunderous. It wasn't just for her courage, it was for the recognition that her story was not unique. It was shared by so many, in ways both small and large, across every corner of society. The final speaker of the day was Camille Hayes. She walked onto the stage with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the fight wasn't over but also knew the power of persistence. "We've come a long way," Camille began, her voice calm but resolute. "But let's not mistake progress for completion. The systems we've built, the biases we've upheld took generations to create. They will take generations to dismantle." Her gaze swept the room, landing on Victoria for a brief moment before moving on. "But what gives me hope is this: every step forward, no matter how small, matters. Every conversation, every act of accountability, every choice to do better, it all adds up. And it's not just about what we do in moments of crisis. It's about what we do every day." Camille's voice grew stronger, her passion igniting the room. "This is not just a fight for Horizon Airlines. It's a fight for our communities, for our children, for the world we want to leave behind. And it's a fight we cannot afford to lose." As the event concluded, the audience filed out of the auditorium, their conversations filled with a mix of hope and resolve. Alexander and Camille stood by the exit, shaking hands and exchanging quiet words with attendees. When Victoria approached, she hesitated for a moment before extending her hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Camille took her hand, her grip firm but warm. "Thank yourself," she replied. "You made the choice to change. Now keep making it." Victoria nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "I will." Later that evening, as Alexander and Camille walked through the now empty terminal, the echoes of the day lingered in their minds. The journey they had embarked on months ago was far from over. But the path ahead felt clearer now. "Do you think they'll follow through?" Camille asked, her voice quiet. "Some will," Alexander said, "and some won't. But that doesn't change what we have to do." Camille slipped her arm through his, a faint smile on her lips. "Then we keep going," she said. And together, they walked on, their steps steady, their resolve unbreakable. The winds of change were blowing. And though the storm was far from over, the skies were beginning to clear.